Imagine for a moment, the Titanic sinking not in 1912 but today. Picture drones quietly circling overhead, passengers reaching for their smartphones, live streaming the confusion as it unfolds. Tweets and videos would spread in real time with the world watching every moment. Radar systems that today can warn ships of objects dozens of miles away might have caught the iceberg before disaster struck. Or would they? What if those live streams could actually save lives? It's a haunting thought, especially when we remember how quickly news travels now compared to a century ago. Before we imagine this modern scenario, let's quietly step back to that cold April night in 1912 and see what really happened. The story of the Titanic's final hours is one of quiet confidence giving way to confusion and fear. On that clear April night in 1912, the ship moved steadily through calm waters, its passengers enjoying the comfort and luxury that had come to define the voyage. The air was cold, but the mood on board was relaxed. No one suspected that disaster was approaching. As the hours passed, small choices and overlooked warnings quietly set the stage for what would come. Captain Smith kept the ship moving at about 22 knots, even though reports of icebergs had come in from other vessels. The radio operators, busy with a steady stream of passenger telegrams, sometimes missed or set aside safety messages. There was no radio act yet, so personal messages could take priority over urgent alerts. This meant that warnings about ice ahead did not always reach those who needed them. Up in the crow's nest, the lookouts watched the dark horizon without binoculars. The keys to the binoculars locker had been taken off the ship by Second Officer David Blair before departure, an odd detail, made more memorable by the fact that those keys were later auctioned off in 2007. Without them, spotting a looming iceberg on a moonless night was almost impossible. When the iceberg finally appeared, it was just a shadow. There was no time to turn the ship aside. The collision itself was quiet, a scraping sound along the starboard side. Many passengers barely noticed at first. Some felt a faint jolt, while others heard a muffled noise. Still, the ship kept its lights and heat, which gave a false sense of safety. For a while, some people hesitated to leave their cabins. The Titanic was supposed to be unsinkable, and that belief lingered. As water began to fill the lower compartments, the crew started to prepare the lifeboats. There were only 20 lifeboats, far too few for all the people on board. Some boats were launched half empty, either because the crew worried that the davits couldn't hold the weight, or because they thought help was coming soon. Families were separated in the confusion, and many men were told to stand back as women and children were given priority. The orchestra played quietly as panic grew, their music a calm background to the rising fear. Distress calls were sent by wireless operators using both CQD and SOS signals, but the response was slow. The nearest hope, the Carpathia, was more than 50 miles away and took about 4 hours to reach the site. Survivors in lifeboats and those clinging to wreckage waited in the cold, listening to the fading cries of others in the water. The loss was staggering, over 1,500 lives. The empty lifeboats, the missed warnings, and the slow rescue became symbols of what went wrong. Looking back, it's natural to wonder, but could any of these mistakes be prevented now? Let's take a quiet look at how things might unfold if a ship like the Titanic faced disaster in our own time. Today's vessels are surrounded by layers of technology that would have seemed impossible in 1912. Modern ships use X-band radar and scanners with rotating antennas sending out microwaves to detect objects, even in thick fog. These systems can spot icebergs dozens of miles away, giving crews time to adjust their course. Alongside radar, international conventions like SOLAS require ships to maintain a continuous watch and use electronic chart displays. So any route correction happens quickly and with careful oversight. It's a far cry from the days when a lookout's eyesight was the only defense. Even so, technology is only part of the story. Human judgment still matters. There are protocols for navigation, and officers are trained to follow them, but mistakes can still happen. If something did go wrong, the experience for passengers would be very different. Nearly everyone carries a smartphone, ready to record and share anything unusual. A sudden jolt or an unexpected announcement would be captured and streamed within moments. Videos would appear on social media almost instantly, and the world would watch the story unfold in real time. We've seen this before. When the Costa Concordia ran aground in 2012, images and hashtags spread quickly, shaping public reaction and increasing demands for answers while the rescue was still ongoing. Communication in a crisis is no longer limited to the ship's radio. Today, distress signals are sent out through official emergency beacons called EPIRBs, which broadcast a ship's location to rescue services. Smartphones can help by sharing GPS data, but EPIRBs remain the backbone of maritime emergency response. Rescue operations now include helicopters and nearby vessels, often arriving within hours. Modern shipping lanes are more closely monitored, and coordination between ships is routine, so help is rarely far away. This speed and organization make survival much more likely than it was in the past. But technology doesn't just change rescue efforts, it changes how the world reacts. News of a disaster would reach every corner of the globe in minutes. Raw footage and personal stories would fill timelines, making the event feel immediate and personal. The scrutiny would be intense, and companies would face public questions before official statements could be made. Still, not every risk has vanished. Ships now travel through icy waters in the Arctic and Antarctic, where even advanced radar and mapping can't prevent every accident. Remote locations bring their own challenges, and sometimes help still takes time to arrive. Modern steel and better training have reduced the chance of catastrophic failure, but the sea always holds some surprises. Financial and legal responses to maritime disasters have changed as much as the ships themselves. In 1912, the Titanic's insurance coverage stood at £1 million, about £115 million today. The premium was set at just 0.75%, a quiet sign of how much faith insurers placed in the ship's reputation for safety. When the unthinkable happened, more than 60 London insurers shared the burden, but the payouts to families were modest. Today, the network of financial protections is far more intricate. Modern maritime insurance covers not only the ship itself, but also the people on board, with clear pathways for passengers to claim compensation for lost belongings, injuries, or emotional trauma. In some places like the United States, there's no cap on an operator's liability. U.S. law may even award punitive damages if negligence is proven. Legal standards have also moved forward. Back in 1912, maritime law was outdated and didn't offer much protection to passengers or their families. Now, investigations and court cases are expected after any large-scale accident. The Costa Concordia disaster in 2012 made this clear. The ship carried more than twice as many people as the Titanic, but far fewer lives were lost, 32 in total. In the aftermath, operators faced not only criminal charges, but also multi-million euro settlements with victims and their families. These legal developments show how much more is demanded of companies today, both in how they prevent disasters and how they respond when things go wrong. The way people experience and process a tragedy like this has changed too. In 1912, news traveled slowly, and early reports were often wrong, sometimes giving families false hope. Now, information spreads instantly. Passengers would share videos and updates as events unfolded, and the world would watch together. This immediacy can be a double-edged sword. Survivors might find their stories widely shared before they have time to process what happened, and the collective response online could quickly turn to outrage or calls for change. At the same time, this kind of attention might push authorities and companies to act more quickly and transparently than ever before. Even with all these advances, the emotional toll remains. Whether in 1912 or today, the shock and grief of a maritime disaster are profound. What has changed is the way that grief is witnessed and responded to. No longer isolated, but part of a shared experience that stretches across the globe. Could a modern insurer even survive the financial storm of a full-scale loss? These are the questions that linger as we look at how far we've come, and how the lessons of the past still echo in the choices we make now. Looking at the Titanic's legacy, we see how tragedy can quietly push safety forward. The disaster led to the Solace Convention, requiring enough lifeboats for all, and inspired the 1914 Radio Act, which mandated 24-hour radio watch on passenger ships. These changes reshaped how ships operate and how crews respond to danger, making sea travel safer for millions. Yet, risks remain. Human error still challenges technology, And as ships venture into remote places like the Arctic, new hazards emerge. These modern cruise routes are now a front line for testing the next generation of safety measures. If this exploration gave you new insights into maritime safety's evolution, consider subscribing for more calm journeys into history's mysteries.
For over a century, people have wondered, could the Titanic ever rise again? Imagine, about 2 miles down in the North Atlantic, the great ship resting in silence, split apart on the sea floor. At first glance, it seems like only a question of engineering, a problem waiting for a practical solution. We'll quietly look at why law and respect, deep-sea decay and sheer cost keep the ship where it lies. Let's take a quiet look at how, across time, people have still tried to imagine ways of bringing her back. In the years just after the disaster, the idea of raising the Titanic began to surface almost immediately. By 1912, families of first-class passengers such as John Jacob Astor, Benjamin Guggenheim, and George Widener were quietly exploring whether salvage might be possible. Their interest was not only in the grandeur of the ship itself, but also in the hope of retrieving belongings or keepsakes tied to those they had lost. They reached out to the Merritt and Chapman Derrick and Wrecking Company, one of the most capable firms of the time, to ask if recovery was within reach. The answer was firm. With the technology then available, the plan was impossible. Even so, the raw grief of the era sparked ambitious ideas. Some thought the wreck could be pulled to the surface through sheer mechanical force. In 1914, a proposal appeared describing the use of massive electromagnets lowered from above, devices that would attach themselves to Titanic's steel hull. Winches mounted on surface ships would then pull, as if tugging the vessel straight out of the seabed. While simple in theory, the plan belonged more to science fiction than real engineering. The magnets did not exist at the scale required, and the immense pressure of the deep ocean was completely underestimated. Alongside such engineering dreams, some desperate suggestions briefly appeared. A few writers speculated about blasting away surrounding seabed with explosives to release the ship. These thoughts were short-lived and never acted upon, but they reveal the level of longing people felt in those early years, and how imagination often leapt ahead of practicality. Other schemes took a different direction, embracing the principle of buoyancy rather than brute strength. If the ship could not be pulled, perhaps it could be floated. Engineers and amateur inventors alike drew up plans to send down huge containers filled with air or gas, fastening them along Titanic's hull until the ship itself rose like a cork through water. The difficulty was staggering. Hundreds of such tanks would have been required, each lowered by cable through nearly 2 miles of shifting currents. The sheer weight and logistics were far beyond what was possible in an age without modern submersibles or deep-sea robotics. By the mid-20th century, the more imaginative ideas for raising Titanic became even more elaborate, though the forces at play nearly 4 kilometers down told a different story. At that depth, every inch of the wreck lies under about 6,000 pounds of pressure, like a small car pressing down on a single square inch. This reality framed both the dreams that continued to appear and the reasons they faded. One of the most famous suggestions was to fill the ship with millions of ping-pong balls. Since they float, the thinking went, they could lift Titanic back to the surface. Yet under such immense pressure, any ordinary plastic ball would simply implode long before reaching the wreck. Others imagined a stranger version of buoyancy by packing the ship with Vaseline. While technically lighter than water, the vision ignored the impossibility of lowering enormous barrels to nearly 13,000 feet and the fact that cold and pressure would alter the material itself. Some proposals reached for more creative approaches. Designers pictured Titanic packed with pressure-resistant glass spheres, each capable of holding air and creating lift. But the scale was staggering. Millions of units had to be manufactured, shipped, and placed. By the time cost estimates appeared, they approached hundreds of millions of dollars, even in mid-century values, rendering the concept little more than a sketch on paper. One of the boldest schemes suggested encasing the ship in ice by pouring liquid nitrogen over its hull, the idea being that a frozen block would float upward as an artificial iceberg. Engineers at the time calculated that 500,000 tons of liquid nitrogen would be required, along with an entire offshore liquefaction plant to supply it. The idea may have sounded poetic, but it was utterly beyond reach. Looking back, these plans may sound whimsical, bordering on fantasy, yet they also speak to the emotional need of people to imagine action, to believe that something could still be done for a ship that had come to symbolize so much loss. In that way, the ideas say as much about grief and memory as they do about engineering. The true turning point came in September 1985, when Robert Ballard's team located Titanic using the deep-sea vehicle Argo. A single boiler marked the find, and what followed ended decades of speculation. Cameras revealed a wreck ripped in two, its stern collapsed into tangled steel, its bow driven deep into the seabed. Between them stretched a debris field covering nearly 3 miles. The vision of a vessel lying intact, waiting to be lifted whole, was gone forever. What human eyes had once pictured as a preserved ship turned out instead to be a fragile grave. The steel was already breaking down into rust, the decks collapsing in places, the structure too delicate to ever move without destruction. Which brings us to a quieter question. If attempts to raise the ship proved impossible, what would it mean even today to imagine fully restoring Titanic? If someone were to announce in 2025 that Titanic could finally be raised, the idea might sound bold at first. But you know, the closer you look at the obstacles, the clearer it becomes that a genuine restoration is just not possible. 4 barriers stand out: the ship's structural fragility, its ongoing decay, its legal and memorial protection, and, well, the staggering cost of any attempt. The first challenge is the wreck's condition. Titanic's steel is no longer solid in the way people imagine. A newly identified bacterium, named Halomonas titanicae, consumes the iron and leaves behind rusticles, fragile, icicle-like growths that crumble when touched. These structures have actually replaced large portions of the ship's material strength. What once was steel plate is now brittle and hollow, making the wreck far too unstable to lift or even secure with equipment. These changes are not only invisible processes, but also clearly visible over time. One of the starkest examples is Captain Smith's quarters. In 1996, cameras still showed a recognizable bathtub, furnishings, and parts of the deckhouse around it. By 2019, those features were gone, the deck collapsing into heaps of twisted metal. What held its form one decade can quietly vanish in the next. The whole wreck is following the same pattern of collapse, leaving little to preserve. Even where recovery has been attempted, the amount of effort required underscores how impractical restoring the entire ship would be. In 1998, a 15-ton section of Titanic's hull, known as the Big Piece, was raised. Special cranes and precise planning made the lift possible, but that was only the beginning. Conservators then spent 20 months bathing the metal in sodium carbonate solution to flush out salts and stabilize what remained. That was for a single piece of wall. Scaling such treatment up to an entire ocean liner makes the idea of full recovery feel less like restoration and more like an impossibility. Then comes the legal and ethical boundary. The wreck is formally protected as a maritime memorial, recognized by both the United States and Britain under an international agreement. Article 4, Section 1 affirms that salvage for simple recovery is prohibited, with preservation given priority. NOAA has supported this position, treating the site with the respect due to a grave. RMS Titanic Incorporated does hold rights to recover artifacts, but even modest proposals have caused public concern. In 2020, when the company suggested retrieving Titanic's wireless set, the idea was condemned by many who saw it as trespassing into a resting place. And finally, there is the matter of cost. When the Costa Concordia cruise ship was salvaged off Italy after its sinking in 2012, it was far easier to access shallow water, upright position, and modern ship design. Even then, the operation cost around $800 million. Titanic lies 13,000 feet below the Atlantic, in pieces, and far less stable. Any attempt to recover it would be many times more complicated, likely costing billions. Taken together, these barriers, fragility, collapse, law, and cost, explain why 2025 cannot see a true restoration. The ship will never return whole to the surface, but its lasting presence does not depend on being lifted skyward. It rests instead in a different form of remembrance that endures quietly in the present. In thinking about what the future holds, it helps to remember the difference between preserving and restoring. The ship itself cannot be saved, but artifacts can. We saw this with the big piece, carefully lifted and stabilized over months of conservation work, or in contrast with Captain Smith's cabin, where visible rooms seen in the 1990s had fully collapsed by 2019. These moments remind us what may be preserved and what must be left undisturbed. Perhaps the truest restoration lies in memory, keeping stories and artifacts alive with quiet respect. If you found this calming, consider subscribing for more gentle looks at curious histories.